In this episode, I talk with Dotan Horovits, Principal Developer Advocate at Logs.io, Cloud Native Ambassador for the CNCF, and host of the Open Observability Talks Podcast. We discuss the current state of open source software, the broad scope of licensing, and why there is so much more to open source beyond the licensing. So open source is making its rounds again in the news. It seems like there's a trend of vendor-owned projects that are getting relicensed, once they reach maturity or when the vendor IPOs. Is this the dark side of open source? Is vendor-owned open source an oxymoron? And you might notice those last two lines there, I took them from a really awesome source. Some of your writings and ramblings I found, which were actually fantastic. I learned quite a bit from going through your blog.
Yeah, thanks. And as you can see, maybe my shirt, for those watching, can see that I'm a bit of a Star Wars fan. So the dark side, it's part of that inspiration. But yeah, I've been talking about for a good few years, let's put it this way, about open source, looking realistically at open source, and that open source can turn to the dark side, if you may. And many of that is vendor-owned open source. You mentioned lastly in the news, which is primarily with HashiCorp, that decided, to take all of its open source projects, Terraform obviously, but all the other popular projects, Vault and everything else, and essentially move them from open source to a non-open source license, to BSL. And the thing is that it's not new. I've been through that with a few cycles with Elastic, relicensing Elasticsearch and Kibana, and with Grafana Labs, and we've seen that in the industry with Confluent and MongoDB and Redis Labs and many more. So I guess there is something about vendor-owned open source that is challenging, and to the extent that I wrote that blog post that you mentioned a few years ago, asking the very honest question: is vendor-owned open source an oxymoron? Is that something that is something that we should just be cautious of? And even open source champion Red Hat recently, just last month, did a change in the source code terms for CentOS, essentially limiting or narrowing the steps for Linux community, and specifically for let's say competitive Linux distros for the RHEL, for the enterprise ones like Alma Linux, Rocky Linux, Oracle Linux, and all of these. So it's not necessarily licensing. In this case, it's not even relicensing. It's just a change of release policy. But so I guess it can come from in many shapes and forms that open source can turn to the dark side, and even from the least expected, like open source champions such as Red Hat and HashiCorp.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of just segueing right into this, that was a great segue into just what is, you're on an elevator, you got to sell open source to someone. What is open source and why is it valuable in the first place? What's that elevator pitch?
So open source is software that is made for the, I guess, greater good, for the community's good, for everyone to consume, to use, and obviously to contribute back to. That's, I guess, my elevator pitch, but it has lots of fine details in it. Or, if you want to look at it differently, look at the traditional way that we used to do software until, I guess, the open source came to our lives. That was proprietary software. Organizations, just a commercial organization, a vendor, a company decides to create software. So it creates it as a proprietary software that is meant for its own use, typically not even releasing the source code. And obviously, the IP belongs to the company, and the company leases or lets users use the software in return to some sort of a financial arrangement, so of sorts. So that's a proprietary. So open source, I guess, the opposite of everything that proprietary software stands for.
Yeah, the way that I used to look at it is like, okay, I work for an enterprise maybe, and I'm using some big box software. You run the bin file, or you install this software and you use it. If it needs a new feature though, or if something needs to change, and, maybe you open a ticket, or maybe you call support and say, hey, we want this thing. What is the timeline? Is it going to get on the roadmap soon? You don't really know, but a lot of these projects, these open source projects that have so much community backing, like that innovation, that really good feature, it has like a really refined process and somehow finds its way into the product fairly quick a lot of times.
It has its pros and cons. I think what you said is a definite advantage, that if something is meaningful enough for you, you can actually go ahead and contribute it. On my podcast, I'm also a fellow podcaster. I have a show called Open Observability Talks about open source DevOps observability. And a few months ago, I had an episode dedicated to Backstage. That's like the developer platform, new kid on the block that started by Spotify, and then it was open sourced, and now it's part of the CNCF. And the head of engineering that led essentially both the internal development at Spotify and then afterwards the open source of that, gave me an amazing story. The day happened, like they had on their backlog for so long, their own engineering within Spotify wanted dark mode, and they couldn't get to it because priorities. And then he gave the example that at some point they decided to just put it out there in the community as a suggestion. And within 24 hours, it came back with implementation. So, and they said it was very difficult to pitch the value of open source to Spotify, because Spotify is not even a software company. It sells music. So it's not about selling software products. But that one incident just, the bells rang with the executive management about the power of open source and running something with the community. So I definitely agree with you, although there are some times that, you expect SLAs and the community is not committed to giving you SLAs. So let's be also realistic about what you can expect or not expect from the open source community if it's not backed by any entity.
Yeah, 100%. And just out of curiosity, is any of the stuff we've talked about so far, like how is it different from like source available software that we've seen a lot of lately? I read a really neat write-up on GitHub actually a few weeks ago about source available, but how is that different?
So source available is like the BSL that HashiCorp changed to is a type of source available, and Elasticsearch that was relicensed to SSPL. It's another source available licensing. In essence, source available. First of all, source available is not open source. And I think the right term, or at least the term that the OSI uses, the Open Source Initiative uses, is FOXPEN source license, because source available makes it a bit maybe vague. But essentially, it means as plainly as it says that the source code is available. The problem is that people think that if you have access to the source code and not just compiled binaries or packages or something like that, it means that it's open source, and that's wrong. So source available is not open source. One of the tenets of being open source, if we look at the open source definition, is the availability of the source code, but that's just one out of a few of these. So source available are very much like the proprietary software that we talked about before, with the addition that they do allow you access. You can just read the source code, which can be, by the way, very helpful. Let's be very honest. If I need to debug the problems and issues, and I can see also the source code of the platform or library or whatnot that I use, it's very, very helpful. And if I can run with the debugger step by step into that, or maybe if I want to ask even for enhancements by the vendor, and I can see how it's implemented and maybe have more fine-tuned feature requests, that's great. But this is not what you said about, which is that I can take it, I can maybe contribute back code, maybe I can take that and repackage it, modify it, and many other aspects of open source.
Interesting. So is there, who's to say that I can't go and just say, oh, I'm open source, this is a license, and that's the end of it? Is there some sort of governance body that's going to say, hey, no, this isn't open source, like these are the open source standards and these are the licenses that mean this?
Yeah, so there is the OSI that I mentioned before. The Open Source Initiative is essentially the body that you talked about. They have a map. First of all, they are behind the open source definition, a very clear, concise, and community-driven definition of what is open source, these tenets that I was mentioning. And then they review the suggested licensing and make sure that they adhere to this. And if not, they just flag it. So you have a very clear listing and a database of which types of licenses are open source and which ones are not.
Awesome. So you're an ambassador for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF for short. That's awesome, by the way. But first off, what is the CNCF? What role does the CNCF or foundations more broadly play in, open source software?
So the CNCF, or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, is an open source foundation, same as the Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, Apache Foundation. All of these are different types of foundations, which I think are material to the open source world. You asked what foundations in general role they play, even before the CNCF specifically. The risks that we talked about with vendor-owned open source, or with even individual contributors, like most of the open source out there on GitHub is run by one or maybe two individuals. That's the vast majority of things that you'll find on GitHub. So even if it's just individuals, the foundations bring an entity that on the other and the first one aspect or benefit is that it's neutral. It's usually not one commercial entity governing, but rather many vendors participate and also end users. Secondly, it comes with a framework and they own, so they are the owners of these projects. No single vendor, even if it is a partner or a sponsor or whatnot, they don't own. So the legal entity is this foundation, and they also come with very clear governance policies and guidelines on that help steer the open source in the right direction in terms of to mitigate these sorts of risks of open source disappearing or becoming controlled by a single entity, or many other aspects. So and also things about licensing and many other aspects. So these are the foundations in general, and I think, if you ask me, the safest choice if you need to, if you're in the junction of vetting several open source tools, at least in these respects of these risks, I think foundational open source is the safest path. If there are other considerations obviously for vetting tools, but in this respect, definitely. And specifically the CNCF, most of the people know the CNCF in the context of Kubernetes, of course. So that's the project around which the CNCF was formed, and it's still the central project. But today there's like 160 something different projects around that, including Prometheus and Flux and Argo and many other popular projects. All of them hosted under the CNCF. And this is the house. This is the team that escorts these projects in a nutshell.
Okay, so really, the options for open sourcing a project, you really just have like vendor open source. You might have maybe one or two people even just controlling a repo, controlling a project, and then you have foundational, the foundation being the steward of the open source project. Those are kind of the pillars there.
These are the three options as we see, and each one has its pros and cons. But probably, for example, we all remember the Log4Shell vulnerability that struck all of us, all the industry, and by that we realized how popular Log4j is, Log4j2, and that was a project maintained by like two folks there, individual aficionados, making no material money out of that. And as romantic as it sounds, the romantic perception of open source. In order to build your mission critical systems, you want something that you can rely on in production at scale. So I think that foundations that make sure that there are also vendors and end users and a broader mix, and also broader adoption, because they're also vessels for creating adoption to these projects and creating the synergy with other projects and so on. This helps in these respects.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so you sort of mentioned earlier already, the HashiCorp, relicensing, and Terraform's one of my favorite. I'm more I started coding, just with bash scripting to Perl to Python, trying to get more proficient at Golang more and more every day. It's been a shift for me. But Terraform has been like the first infrastructure as code tool that I've really liked a lot. These tools tend to come and go, and they have limited value, limited impact sometimes. But Terraform's been one of the ones I've used a ton in production environments, and I've helped see a provider come to fruition as well. And yeah, it's a huge part of the ecosystem now. So they changed from as we talked about Mozilla Public to BSL. This can't be the first time this has happened, though. You kind of mentioned a few other examples, but can you talk? Is there like a long history to look at? Like, can we learn from that history? Is there going to be a new way? If you're a vendor or you're coming to market with something that's open source these days, is there like a new way to think about what that license really means, what that software is really going to mean? Because you kind of have to look in the future a little bit as well. Like, what is this going to become? So what are your thoughts there?
So first of all, as I briefly mentioned, we've learned, I can tell you on my own, even in the current, I work currently at logs.io, and we've been through that, at least in this company, one company that I've been working with now, at least a couple of times, if not more. Actually, three if you now count HashiCorp, because we're also users of HashiCorp products and projects. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I mentioned with Elastic relicensing, Elasticsearch and Kibana, which are, for those who don't know, like the most popular at the time tools, open source for log analytics and log management. And it used to be Apache 2.0, which is by all people considered the classic open source license. And they relicensed this to a non-open source, to SSPL, a service-side public license, and their own Elastic license, proprietary one, so dual license. And by the way, SSPL was invented by Mongo back when it relicensed it from open source as well. So it's reuse of the similar that happened to the industry with MongoDB. So that's a Foxpen license, a source available that we talked about before. And same here, it's a database. This is the search engine that, I don't know, lies in the heart of your system, whether it's a enterprise searching or observability related, log analytics, so on. And having that relicensed one day from open source to a non-open source, that was, a shock to the industry. So much so that you mentioned forking. So that was the reaction back then, taking the last Apache 2.0 licensed version release and just forking it into something that is today called OpenSearch, a project that essentially is a fork of Kibana, a fork of Elasticsearch, and since then has grown to become its own, exploring lots of other directions and dimensions that Elasticsearch and Kibana did not have. We've been through a similar just a couple of years ago with Elasticsearch. That's one example. Another example that I personally been through with my company was Grafana Labs, that took all of its suite, Grafana, Loki, Tempo. These are, again, sorts of visualization tools in the observability space, and relicensed them from Apache 2.0 to AGPL, which is a slightly different case because AGPL is open source. But also, and that's why I keep on emphasizing to people, open source is not just about licensing, okay? Things can happen even within the open source licensing realm, and also outside of the licensing, the open licensing at all. So this is a case where AGPL is still open source, but Apache 2.0 to AGPL is a major change, a major earthquake to the users, because AGPL is what is known as a copyleft license, a license that is, in a way, I guess, goes viral because if you modify it, you have to open source the code that uses it also as under AGPL. So it sort of forces the licensing on your code utilizing it. So it's a whole different ball game for those who started using it under Apache 2.0 assumptions and suddenly are stuck with AGPL. So as I said, it's really diverse. It comes in many shapes and forms, and this ultimately comes down to being a business risk for vendors. If you think about SaaS providers that it influences, or even, by the way, other open source projects. If you're an open source project that uses Apache 2.0 and you use a library that is suddenly AGPL, and the AGPL forces its licensing on you, that's also a problem. And the CNCF, being an ambassador of the CNCF, I can tell you the CNCF issued a directive to all its projects, open source projects, not to use AGPL and not to upgrade. For those for licensing that changed, they said don't either move to a different tool or don't upgrade, but definitely freeze the license, but don't upgrade to the relicensed version. So this is a problem not just for commercial entities, but also for the open source projects and open source community itself.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lot of risk calculation, risk mitigation. You have to really think about these things. You can't just think, there's much more to it than saying, oh, this is open source, this is the current license, I'm going to use this in my product, and then go get maybe venture capital, do a round, get some funding and build some sweet project, and then something changes and like, oh boy, yeah, problems. Yeah. Interestingly, so can a vendor just, do the Thanos finger snap and just change that license like overnight? Or is there some sort of paperwork involved or something, or how does that happen?
So as you said, the license is not everything, and license can change. How easy or not it is, it depends on many other elements, primarily the governance. If you have a clear governance policy that dictates things, it makes it easier. But ultimately, if there is one entity controlling it, that entity also, first of all, can change the governance policy. Yeah, so it might take slightly longer, but once you have one entity controlling it, that's a risk. And this is why when you come to when you use an open source or choose an open source, you need to do it wisely and factor in these risks as well. That's for sure.
Yeah. The reason I ask that is just kind of thinking in my head. Like, I came from the big enterprise space. I worked in enterprise for like over 15 years, and just thinking like a lot of times like something that's really helpful is like having some warning, like, okay, we know that like this time next year X, Y, and Z is happening. Okay, so we can plan for it. We're going to throw together a tiger team. We're going to start shifting, changing things over, doing whatever we have to do to work around an issue. But if it just happens like, oh, it's in the news, next release, new license, that just doesn't really there's not a lot of like planning or coordination that can happen if you're a consumer of said project or projects.
Yeah, they didn't give any warnings, not in HashiCorp case, not in Elastic relicensing or Grafana Labs or any other that I know. Maybe some I don't know. I don't know of any warnings that they issued about the intent. Which makes sense because they do the relicensing as a defensive move against their competitors, so they don't want to tip them off about the move. So it makes sense that they would not announce. What you can do as a user is to work with cautious, just like you work with cautious in terms of security. So I can give you a few tips that I give my other users in this case, and many come to me. I actually wrote a blog post just over the weekend to summarize some tips that I find myself reiterating now that it becomes relevant again with the HashiCorp licensing. But just a few of them, obviously. For example, managing your third-party licensing exposure, just like you manage the third-party security exposure. So beyond obviously choosing the least restrictive licenses, also look at issues of license contamination. Like, as I mentioned, Apache 2 that contains GPL, that could be a problem. So managing the licensing exposure, and also being careful with automation. You said that you use automation for like Terraform, and many others do that in the CI/CD pipeline, and we're all in favor of automation. But you need to make sure to put license compliance checks before updating a third-party version. You need to be aware of auto updates without safeguards in your CI/CD pipeline. Just think about people whose automation would have upgraded now the Terraform version from the Mozilla license to the BSL license without checks. And by the way, it's so in Elasticsearch case, for example, it was a minor release. It was 7.10 to 7.11, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not even a major release in this case. So you need to put the licensing, you need to check for code smells. Many of us go into the source code of the projects to, again, debug or maybe open a more fine-tuned feature request. So many of us know the code inside and out. When you go into the code, keep your nose open for all sorts of code smells that may indicate that there's, I don't know, a mix of proprietary and open source or all sorts of telemetry collection. I think that might indicate that there is an intent there. So, and if you do need to change the open source, make sure that you prefer extending it via plugins or this sort, rather than extending like by changing the downstream code, because this is the easiest for them to block. When you relicense, the first thing that will be blocked is code modifications, whereas if you extended it via APIs, plugins, and so on, this might be a bit more compliant and less prone to this. So these sorts of tips, I think, is something that you can engage as part of your daily routine in software release cycle that can help you maybe get an earlier detection because they don't give you any alert. So these are at least the tips for using open source. If you want, I can give one for vetting open source if you're in the junction of choosing between several tools. As I mentioned before, this is also part of the factoring that you need to do.
Yeah, that would be great. And that's really good advice. If you're an automation heavy shop and you already have pipelines set up, you already have control over your, going from, Git flow and, making your way to like a production level main branch, adding some steps in there into your GitHub Actions or Circle CI to, check for licensing mayhem. And having that, that way, so nothing, it's like the shift left thing. Okay, it's never going to make it into that production branch. And then we're not going to have problems with it. We can see it coming and we can react to it, just so we don't get ourselves in trouble as well by using something and then getting, heaven forbid, something legal happening or, something of that sort.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, when you choose a tool, remember the things we talked about before. So don't just look at the licensing. Obviously, licensing is important. Start by licensing that makes sense to you. So Apache 2.0, MIT, BSD, Mozilla, it's fine. So, but that's one. And remember that source available or Foxpen source license is not open source. So don't get confused there. That's something that I guess some users get this confused because the term source available. But all of that is just the licensing aspect. And remember, it's not just the licensing. So ask yourself and try and check who's behind the open source. If it's a one-man show, that's a single point of failure, right? It's this person may disappear one day and that's it. And on the other hand, if it's a vendor, as I said, it may pull the rug and you may find yourself in this rights ratchet situation, which you don't want. So my recommendation, obviously, if you have the choice, is to prefer foundational open source. I think they prove once again and again that this is the safest option, although it's not bulletproof, obviously. But if you have the option, definitely take it at least under consideration. And maybe one more thing that I would mention is the governance policy. Try and check what the governance policy, that there is a very clear governance policy, how they ensure that no single entity grabs control as part of the governance, and what's the promotion path to contributor, to maintainer, who can review, who can approve PRs, who can ultimately decide on relicensing, obviously. And if you are a very cautious, risk-averse organization, and this is something that is problematic for you, then you can also consider vendor distros of the open source. So packaging of the open source. So it's not a closed source, but you have a vendor backing it that packages it for you and provide you with the indemnification. So effectively the insurance policy to mitigate so you're not directly exposed by these relicensings. And of course, on the way, they provide support, they provide certification to run on certain hardware platforms if it's on-prem, or if it's a SaaS, then it's managed. So this is another way that you can use if you're specifically risk averse and you don't want to expose yourself to these sorts of things, but you still want to work with open source.
So one question that I had, I was thinking about this earlier on, and it just kind of I'm sort of like a glass half full kind of person. Like I look at things that happen maybe, and I was like, I sort of think, okay, how can this be made like better? Like how can there be innovation from this? Like how is it going to make the world a better place, even though like things may be crumbling, whatever. But with these past experiences you've seen sort of play out with the open source and the licensing changes, the first thing I thought when I saw the OpenTF manifesto and the fork and everything, I was thinking, man, this could be a great opportunity for innovation. I know it's kind of under bad circumstances at the beginning, but is this going to be better? Is it going to be a net positive over time? So what about those past forks and projects you talked about earlier? Like, do you think it's been a net positive? Do you think there's a positive outcome, or has it just kind of been tough on the community overall?
It's a tough question to answer, to be honest, and there are pros and cons. My initial sense is, as you like being a community person, that's something that I promote and I evangelize on community and open source. These are the two pillars, and seeing a community, one community backing one successful open source, and then seeing this community splitting is heartbreaking. And also pragmatically seeing that people could be now either here or there means you just split the community, split the investment, split the innovation into two places rather than joining forces. On the other hand, I'm looking, for example, now 2 years into OpenSearch, for instance. I think it's a very, very successful project on its own. It took a roadmap that in many respects is different than what Elasticsearch and Kibana used to be. Broader observability areas with AI and security and others. So it's interesting, and lots of, I think it enabled lots of additional players to join in that did not find their place when it was under Elastic NV, the vendor entity. So this is definitely something that was positive that came out of it. And I hope it will be the same with OpenTF. I see players that, at least reading, the Hacker News and the discussions on the forums, that many said that, hey, we tried, it's not just the relicensing now, we tried contributing to Terraform in the past, and they blocked us or just did not respond, and it stayed stale and things like that. And now, hopefully, they will find the room to contribute these things, maybe reducing. When it's foundational open source, you don't have the tension with the commercial offering. So oftentimes when it's a vendor-owned open source, you find the tension between features that they deliver as part of their commercial offering and keep it out of the open source. And when someone else wants to contribute these sorts of functionalities, then obviously there's a tension, and then it doesn't find its way, let's put it this way, into the open source. When it's foundational, it should be balanced out, and everyone who has something meaningful to the community to contribute and can also put the efforts in actually implementing it can just do that. So hopefully OpenTF will offer that, and hopefully to become a foundational open source. Being wearing my CNCF ambassador hat again, the mission statement of OpenTF, at least from the manifesto, is to make it part of the CNCF. It's very early on, and there is a process to become part of the foundation. I'm very hopeful that at least in the very near future, we'll hear that it's part of the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation, by the way, is like the parent foundation of the CNCF, and then later on to find its way into the CNCF. I think this synergy between Terraform and the CNCF, the cloud native ecosystem hosted by the CNCF, is very evident. So I think it's a right place to be for Terraform or the Terraform fork as a project. But ultimately, I really hope that this is the direction that it will take, and then to see the net positive that you're talking about.
Great. And I kind of have one more thing that was swimming around in my head. Well, actually, to go back just real quick, just out of curiosity. So, that ambassador title with the CNCF, that's pretty awesome. So what does that entail? Like, what do you do as an ambassador day to day? And, I know you do a lot of events and things like that as well.
Yeah, so it's a program that the CNCF has had for a while, but I guess the first iteration of that became pretty stale and dormant, and then we kicked it off again in KubeCon last year, 2022. And I'm happy to be part of the revamped program. Essentially, is to evangelize on the cloud native ecosystem, the CNCF ecosystem, the open source side, the community side, get more people involved, get people more aware, obviously bring updates about the different projects. And for me, it was a natural thing to become a CNCF ambassador because I did that without the title for many years. So I have my podcast that I mentioned, Open Observability Talks, that a lot of the technology that I cover is a CNCF-based open source projects like Prometheus and OpenSearch that is not a CNCF, but Jaeger and OpenTelemetry and others. And then I talk in many conferences about these open source projects, and I write and I create tutorials and videos and whatnot. So for me, it was doing much of what I did before, just maybe wearing a more formal hat and doing more under the auspices of the CNCF. I also am one of the organizers of the local CNCF chapter in Tel Aviv, where I'm based. And this year we had the Kubernetes Community Day. So it's not just digital, also on-prem, in person, doing events like the Kubernetes Community Days that we held for the first time in Israel this year. And then the CNCF, the central CNCF, decided to host a Cube Day in Tel Aviv, which was exciting. So all these sorts of things that bring the community together in the local regional places, on the digital medium, in the global events like KubeCon. And obviously the most important is there in the working groups, the tags, the technical advisory groups, the SIGs, and all the rest of these forums where the community actually creates the open source and maintains it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, I think I joined the CNCF Slack like over a year ago. I can't remember how long, but just I was in a state of drinking from the fire hose for like weeks. Like there's so many channels, and there's so many just rockstar developers, rockstar thought leaders, just trailblazers in all these chats. And it was just like, wow, just going through and like going back and reading historical stuff. Great. Just fantastic community.
Yeah, highly recommended it. Just to mention to your listeners, you don't need to be a formal member or an employee of a formal sponsor or partner. This is open for everyone. So if you are interested, and I highly recommend, just go in, join the CNCF workspace on Slack, and you'll find a gazillion channels. So find the projects that you favor, whether it's, as I said, Argo CD or OpenTelemetry or Prometheus or FluentD or no more, and just join the relevant groups, join the chatters. The different projects have also usually calls, like Zoom calls that you can join bi-weekly or whatnot, depending on the cadence of the specific groups. There's also special interest groups that focus on specific topics. For example, I like very much the Tag Observability, Technical Advisory Group for Observability, that is not technology specific, but looks more broadly on observability. There are others about security and related and others. So you can find your place. Even, by the way, even if you're not a technical developer, you can get involved. You can get involved with helping documentation, with helping the website, and many, many other places where you can influence. So do check it out. And actually an article that I just saw published recently, this week or last week, about how to get involved with OpenTelemetry that I really liked. I wrote it down because I want to recommend it to my listeners as well. So I can look it up and send it to you. But 5 ways to get involved with OpenTelemetry, just as an example for people to get a sense of how many ways there are to get involved.
Awesome. Well, I think really that's a wrap. In the show notes, I'm gonna have your podcast. I'm gonna have some of the excellent blogs, at least that I read, the ones that I found, and a few other places to find you. But where can the population find you on social? Are you on the Twitters or LinkedIn?
Yeah, I'm everywhere. Essentially, my surname at Horovits, Horovits. You'll find me everywhere: GitHub, Twitter, LinkedIn, Medium, WordPress, and everywhere else. Luckily enough, I'm old enough to have my surname as my handle everywhere. Of course, Mastodon. And Blue Sky. So just feel free to reach out. Check out the podcast. It's also on Twitter at OpenObserve. And if you are by any chance this month, September, in Container Days, I'm going to be talking at Container Days about observability. And next month, at October, I'm actually going to be talking squarely about the dark side, projects turning to the dark side, coincidentally. So if you are at SRECon EMEA in Dublin, do join my talk and you'll hear more, and we can discuss more about all these case studies of open source turning to the dark side, and most importantly, how we can be more aware of the risks and factor them into the way that we use, vet, and even build open source ourselves to make it safer.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time. I know it's late for you. Really appreciate it. And yeah, I'll let you go now. Get some rest.
Thank you very much, William, and best of luck with the new show. It looks cool, and I can't wait to hear some more episodes of yours.